Eliza Vance had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. Redemption's End was a town that lived and died by the sun, a relentless eye and a bleached blue sky that baked the dust into a fine, choking powder. It clung to everything, a gritty shroud over warped wooden storefronts, the silent, watchful faces of its people, and the very air she breathed. For a woman raised on the shaded avenues and intellectual certainties of Boston, this place was a constant, low-grade fever, a state of being she endured rather than inhabited, a penance for a series of misfortunes that had left her adrift in a sea of ochre and unforgiving light. She had arrived not by choice, but by the final, cruel turn of a fate that had stolen her family and her inheritance. Her only remaining asset was the sharp, methodical mind her father, a man who spoke of law as if it were scripture, had so carefully cultivated. This skill for numbers and letters had earned her a precarious position, keeping the ledgers for Silas Blackwood. He was a man who owned most of Redemption's End, from the saloon with its perpetually out-of-tune piano to the general store where credit was a leash he held with a tight fist. His soul, however, seemed to be entirely his own, untouched by generosity or grace. It was in the quiet solitude of his back office, a cramped room smelling of dry paper, stale cigar smoke, and leather, that she first sensed the wrongness. It began not as a discovery, but as a subtle discord. A single note played sour in a familiar tune. A small rancher, a good man named Jedediah, had lost his land. The deed transferred to Blackwood for a debt that seemed impossibly high. Eliza remembered Jedediah's wife in the store just weeks before, her eyes hollow with worry, her hands trembling as she counted out her few coins. The numbers in the ledger were clean, the transaction legally sound. Yet a cold knot of suspicion tightened in Eliza's stomach. Driven by this disquiet, she began her own silent investigation. Late at night, when the town was shrouded in a profound, star-pricked silence, she would let herself back into the office. With a single low-burning lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, she delved into the older, dust-covered ledgers stored in a locked cabinet in the cellar. She learned to work the lock with a hairpin, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination. There, in the brittle, yellowed pages, she found the truth. It wasn't a single crime, but a slow, methodical conquest waged with ink and predatory patience. Mortgages foreclosed just before a harvest brought in its profits. Small, essential loans called in without warning when a family was stricken by illness or drought. Land deeds transferred for pennies on the dollar through clauses written in convoluted legal language. It was a tapestry of ruin, and Silas Blackwood's name was the thread that ran through it all. For a week, the knowledge sat like a stone in her stomach, a secret that poisoned her food and haunted her sleep. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a calm, reasoned tone explaining the vast, often tragic chasm between what was legal and what was just. To remain silent was to become complicit, to let the ink-stained lies become the town's unwritten history. To speak out was to stand utterly alone against a man who held the town marshal in one pocket and the quiet, desperate fear of every citizen in the other. In the end, her conscience proved to be a louder, more insistent master than her fear. She chose not to accuse him in the saloon, not to shout in the streets. Her approach was quiet, deliberate. She copied the most damning entries into a small notebook of her own and arranged a secret meeting with the few ranchers who still held their own land. They gathered in the dead of night in an old, disused barn at the edge of town, the air thick with the smell of hay and apprehension. By the flickering light of a single lantern, she laid the evidence before them, her finger tracing the path of their neighbor's ruin, showing them the cage that was slowly being built around them all, their faces etched with the same sun and worry she saw everywhere, shifted from disbelief to a dawning, terrible understanding, and finally, to a deep, ingrained fear that extinguished the brief flicker of hope in their eyes. The response was as swift as a snake bite, and just as venomous. Blackwood did not even bother to deny the charges. He simply twisted them, turning her diligence into a weapon against her. The very next morning, the marshal, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his star-spangled vest, arrested her not in the name of justice, But in the name of order, the charge was slander, quickly compounded by accusations of fraud, of manipulating the books herself for some nefarious purpose no one bothered to clearly define. The trial was a grotesque farce held in the smoky, whiskey-sour air of the saloon. The jury was composed of men who owed Blackwood their livelihoods, their homes, their very next drink. They looked at their boots, at the whiskey rings on the tables, anywhere but at her face. Blackwood himself sat at a corner table, polishing a silver dollar, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. Eliza spoke clearly and calmly, presenting the facts as she had found them. Her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But her words were hollow echoes in a room that had reached its verdict long before she had been arrested. She was found guilty before she had even finished speaking. The sentence was meant to be a spectacle, a brutal lesson etched not in a law book, but on the back of a woman who dared to read one. A public whipping, as two of Blackwood's burly henchmen dragged her toward the center of the square. She could feel the town's collective gaze upon her, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. It was not a gaze of sympathy, but of morbid curiosity and a palpable, shameful relief that it was her, and not them, standing in the crosshairs of Blackwood's power. The sun beat down, turning the square into a furnace. Sweat traced clean paths through the layers of dust on her cheeks. But she held her chin high, her focus fixed on the hazy, wavering line of the distant horizon. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not let them break the one thing they couldn't touch: her dignity. Her wrists were bound to a rough-hewn post, the coarse rope biting into her skin, scraping it raw. The marshal unrolled a scroll, his voice a flat, uninterested drone as he read the verdict. The words lost to the dry. Indifferent wind. The executioner, a stocky man with a face like sun-cracked leather and eyes as empty as the sky, stepped forward. He unfurled the whip, and the sound it made, a sharp, hungry hiss through the dead air, caused a collective intake of breath from the crowd, a sound of anticipation, not horror. Eliza closed her eyes, not in surrender, but to gather the last of her strength. She thought of her father, of the cool green of a Boston spring, of a world where justice was more than just the will of the strongest man. The executioner's arm began to rise, a dark, deliberate arc against the unforgiving sky. Then, a sound tore through the oppressive stillness, sharp and commanding. It was not a shout, but the crack of a rifle shot that wasn't aimed at anyone, yet it shattered the spell of fear holding the town captive. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a jet-black horse burst into the square, its powerful hooves pounding the earth, scattering dust and terror in its wake. Its rider was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that seemed impossible. Before the executioner could comprehend what was happening, the whip was wrenched from his hand. Two of Blackwood's men lunged forward. Both were thrown to the ground with a brutal, bone-jarring efficiency that spoke of countless battles. A murmur of panic swept through the bystanders as they scrambled back, their morbid curiosity instantly curdling into fear. Eliza barely had time to breathe before a knife flashed, its steel glinting in the sun as it severed the ropes that bound her. Strong arms swept her from her feet and onto the saddle in front of the stranger. She caught a fleeting glimpse of the marshal shouting useless orders, of Blackwood's face, a mask of disbelief contorting into pure fury. And then they were gone. The black horse tore down the street, its hooves striking sparks from the packed earth. The sounds of redemption's end, the shouts, the fear, the entire weight of its suffocating judgment faded behind them, replaced by the thunderous pounding of hooves and the rush of a wind that tasted, for the first time in a long, long time, like freedom. The pounding of hooves was the only sound in Eliza's world for what felt like an eternity, a deep, percussive rhythm that seemed to beat in time with her own frantic heart. She clung instinctively to the stranger who had snatched her from the precipice of public humiliation and pain, her hands gripping the worn, thick leather of his belt as the black horse devoured the miles, leaving redemption's end to shrink into a smudge of dust and bad memories on the horizon. The wind was a physical force, stinging her face, pulling strands of her carefully pinned hair loose and whipping them across her vision. Her body, unaccustomed to the violent motion of a horse at full gallop, protested with a chorus of aches that grew with every jarring stride. She was a creature of books and quiet rooms, of soft chairs and reasoned debate. This raw, untamed flight was an assault on every sense. Only when the last traces of the town were swallowed by the rolling, sun-scorched hills did he slow the horse from its desperate gallop to a steady, ground-covering trot. The sudden change in pace was almost as jarring as the speed had been. The silence that descended was vast and profound, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of hooves on stone and the horse's heavy breathing. Eliza's lungs burned, and her throat was a desert of its own. She remained silent, unsure if speaking would break whatever fragile, unspoken truce existed between them in this endless, indifferent landscape. The man who had saved her seemed carved from the very rock and shadow of this land. He rode with an easy, innate stillness, his broad back a bulwark against the world they had left behind. His focus was fixed forward, his dark eyes constantly scanning the terrain, reading its secrets in a language she could not comprehend. They stopped as dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the western sky, pulling the light from the world. He chose a spot sheltered by a crescent of rust-colored boulders, a place that offered a clear view of their back trail while keeping them hidden from casual observation. He swung down from the saddle with a single, fluid motion that spoke of a life spent in close communion with the animal. He then turned and reached up for her, his expression unreadable. When her boots finally touched the solid earth, her legs trembled so violently they threatened to buckle. He steadied her with a firm hand on her arm, his touch impersonal but solid, and then released her just as quickly. She stumbled toward one of the boulders and sank down, the rough stone a welcome, solid presence against her aching back. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horse and rubbing it down with a handful of dry grass before allowing it to drink sparingly from a water skin. Every movement was deliberate, economical, devoid of any wasted energy. He was a man who understood that survival in this place was a matter of careful calculation. He built a small fire, so small it seemed to defy the encroaching darkness, using twigs and dry brush that gave off almost no smoke. The flames were a small, defiant flicker of warmth and light in the immense, gathering dark. He produced a pouch from his saddlebag, from which he took 2 strips of dried meat, handing one to her without a word. The meat was tough, salty, and tasted of smoke. It was the most welcome meal she had ever eaten. They ate in a silence that felt heavier than the night itself. Eliza watched him across the flickering firelight. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his jaw set, his eyes never still. She could see the faint, silvery lines of old scars on his forearms, pale against his sun-darkened skin. They were stories she could not read, histories of violence and survival that were as foreign to her as the constellations now burning with a cold, brilliant intensity in the sky above. The silence stretched, and in it, her fear, which had been a wild, panicked thing, began to cool and harden into a heavy dread. She was a fugitive, bound to a man she did not know, in a land that was actively trying to kill her. Why the word escaped her? A hoarse whisper, almost lost to the crackle of the fire. He didn't look up from sharpening the blade of a long knife, his hands never ceasing their methodical motion. She cleared her throat and tried again, her voice a little stronger. "Why did you help me?" He finally paused, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers across the flames. There was no pity in them, no kindness, only a flat, level assessment that made her feel as though he were weighing her very soul. "I don't like seeing a stacked deck," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I don't like Silas Blackwood." He offered no more, and the simple, blunt statement seemed to close the door on any further questions. He had not saved her for her own sake, she realized, but as an act of defiance against a shared enemy. The thought was strangely deflating, yet also clarifying. This was not a rescue born of chivalry, it was a partnership forged in mutual opposition. That first night, she lay wrapped in a coarse blanket he had given her, but sleep was a distant shore. Through the blur of exhaustion, she saw him silhouetted against the starlit sky, sitting with his back against a rock, a rifle resting across his knees. He was a sentinel, still and watchful, a part of the silent, dangerous landscape, and she understood that her survival, for now, was entirely in his hands. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of riding, resting, and riding again. The man, who she learned was named Kale, spoke little. His instructions were brief. Direct commands: drink, eat, we move now. He seemed to view her as a piece of cargo, a fragile liability he was obligated to transport. Her soft hands, blistered from gripping the saddle horn, her city dress, torn and stained with dust. Her very presence seemed to be an affront to his self-contained, hardened existence. He doubted her. She could feel it in his silence, in the way his eyes would occasionally flick over her. A quick, dismissive glance that catalogued her weaknesses. During their second night camped in a narrow, wind-scoured arroyo, the tension between them finally found a voice. He had been cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks echoing in the stillness. She sat huddled by the fire, trying to rub some warmth back into her numb fingers. "You will not survive out here," he stated. Not as a threat, but as a simple, undeniable fact. This land chews up people like you and spits out the bones. A spark of defiance, the same spark that had made her stand up to Blackwood, flared within her. "Perhaps I am more resilient than I appear," she said, her voice tight. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Resilience is not learned from books. It is beaten into you by sun and stone and hunger." "My father was a lawyer, but he was also a practical man," she countered, the memory of her father giving her strength. "He believed a mind was useless if the hands were idle. He taught me to shoot. A rifle, not a pistol. He said it was a tool for hunting, for providing, not for settling arguments in a dusty street." Cale stopped his work and looked at her, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't belief. Not yet. But a crack in his certainty. He did not respond. But the next morning, he began her education. It was not a gentle tutelage. His lessons were as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. He began with water, showing her how to spot the deep green of cottonwood trees that signaled a hidden spring, how to dig in a dry riverbed to find the cool, damp sand beneath, how to collect the morning dew from broad leaves with a cloth. He taught her to move, forcing her to walk behind him for hours, correcting her every time a misplaced footfall sent a cascade of pebbles rattling down a slope. "Silence is life," he would say, his voice low. "Sound is a dinner bell for everything that wants you dead." He taught her to see, not just to look. He would stop abruptly and point to a patch of disturbed earth. "What do you see?" he'd ask. At first, she saw nothing but dirt. Slowly, he trained her eye to recognize the faint impression of a shod horse, to tell how many there were, which direction they were headed, and, by the sharpness of the edges, how long ago they had passed. He showed her the subtle signs of a predator's passage, the scrape of a claw on rock, the scat left behind as a territorial marker. The world she had once seen as a monotonous expanse of brown and gray began to resolve into a complex tapestry of signs and stories, a constant, silent dialogue between the hunter and the hunted. Her progress was slow, agonizingly so. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep. Her mind, accustomed to abstract thought, struggled with the brutal, tangible realities of survival. There were moments of despair when she felt she was nothing but a burden, a clumsy student slowing down a master who could have been long gone without her. Yet, she refused to quit, with every sunrise. She pushed herself to her feet, her jaw set with a stubborn determination that began to earn a sliver of his grudging respect. She also began to learn about him, not from his words, but from his silences. Some nights, he would be jolted from a light sleep by nightmares, his hands clenched, a name muttered in a language of guttural sounds she did not recognize. She would pretend to be asleep, her heart aching with a strange, second-hand sorrow. She saw the way he would sometimes touch the long, puckered scar that ran the length of his left forearm, his expression distant and haunted, as if he were touching a ghost. She pieced together a story of a man caught between worlds, belonging to none, a warrior whose battles had left him with wounds far deeper than the ones visible on his skin. The turning point came on their 7th day of flight. They were in the foothills, a labyrinth of canyons and mesas, and their water was dangerously low. The last spring had been a mere trickle, and the relentless sun had sapped their strength. Cale was tense, his focus divided between watching their back trail and searching for the next source of life. He had climbed a high ridge to scout the terrain, leaving her with the horse in the relative cool of a narrow ravine. As she waited, his lessons echoed in her mind. He had told her to observe the land, to understand its rhythms. Her eyes scanned the canyon walls, and then she saw it. On the opposite side, halfway up the rock face, was a thin, almost invisible line of vibrant green, a patch of maidenhair ferns, clinging to a fissure in the stone. She remembered his voice, low and certain. Where that fern grows, water weeps from the rock. Cale had missed it. From his vantage point, the fissure would have been invisible. A surge of adrenaline, a feeling that was not fear but a sharp, focused excitement, coursed through her. She tethered the horse securely and began to climb. Her hands, now calloused and tougher, found purchase on the rough rock. Her boots, scuffed and worn, held firm. She moved slowly, deliberately, testing each hold before trusting it with her weight. It was a difficult, dangerous climb, but the thought of the water and the thought of proving him wrong, of proving herself useful, spurred her on. She reached the ferns, their delicate fronds cool to the touch. Behind them, in a shallow, shaded hollow, water seeped from the rock, slow and clear, collecting in a small, stone basin no bigger than her two hands cupped together. It was a miracle. She drank deeply, the water tasting sweeter than any wine, and then began the careful process of filling their water skins. When Cale returned, his face grim with the news that he had seen nothing for miles. She was waiting for him at the bottom of the ravine. She held out a full water skin. "I found some," she said, her voice steady. He took it from her, his eyes flicking from the full skin to her dust-streaked face, then up toward the canyon wall where she had climbed. He walked to the base of the cliff, looked up at the line of green ferns, and then turned back to her. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply stood there, the full weight of his gaze upon her. Then, he gave a single, slow nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but for Eliza, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. In that one, silent acknowledgement. She was no longer a liability. She was a survivor. She was a partner. And for the first time since they had fled redemption's end, she felt the first, fragile stirring of hope. The single, slow nod from Cale had been a silent treaty, a shift in the subtle tectonics of their partnership. It did not bring warmth, but it did bring a change in the atmosphere between them, like the air after a storm, washed clean and charged with a new potential. Hope, Eliza discovered, was not a grand, soaring emotion, but a quiet, practical thing. It was the confidence in her step as she walked, the way she now scanned the horizon not with a vague sense of dread, but with a purpose, her eyes searching for the signs he had taught her to read. Cale, in turn, began to treat her less like cargo and more like a fellow traveler. He would point out a distant hawk circling on a thermal, explaining how its presence signaled a change in the weather, or show her how to read the age of a track by the way the dust had settled back into it. A quiet respect had taken root in the barren soil of their shared flight, a fragile plant in a harsh and unforgiving world. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. In Redemption's End, Silas Blackwood was a man unaccustomed to being defied. The public escape of Eliza Vance was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult, a crack in the facade of absolute power he had so carefully constructed. His fury was a cold, calculating thing, and he unleashed it not in the form of a clumsy, hot-headed posse, but with a single, carefully chosen instrument of terror. He sent for a man known only as the Ghost, a name spoken in whispers in the darkest corners of the territory. The Ghost was a tracker of legendary skill, an Apache who worked for the highest bidder, a relentless, patient predator who was said to become one with the land he hunted on, leaving no trace of his own while seeing every mistake his quarry made. Eliza and Cale knew nothing of this, but they felt his presence before they ever saw a sign of him. It began as a subtle, prickling sensation on the back of the neck, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The vast open spaces that had once seemed indifferent now felt menacing. The silence no longer empty but filled with a silent, waiting intelligence. The first concrete sign appeared on their 10th day of travel. They awoke in the pre-dawn chill to find their campfire from the night before had been disturbed. The ashes, which Cale had carefully buried, were laid bare, and arranged in the center was a single, black feather from a crow, held in place by a sharpened piece of bone. It was a message, a violation. It said, "I was here while you slept. I could have taken you then. I am letting you run." Cale's reaction was a chilling stillness. All the quiet confidence he had begun to show vanished, replaced by a grim, coiled tension that Eliza had not seen since their first day. He circled the camp, his eyes missing nothing, reading the story in the dust. "He left no tracks," Cale murmured, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was more for himself than for her. None, from that moment on. The nature of their flight changed. It was no longer a journey away from something, but a desperate game of evasion against a pursuer who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The ghost played with them, leaving his markers in their path like a cat toying with a mouse. One day, it was an arrow, its obsidian tip buried deep in a cottonwood tree just yards from where they had rested. Another time, they found a dead rabbit laid carefully across their trail, its throat cut with surgical precision. The psychological toll was immense, fraying their nerves, poisoning their rest with paranoia. Their supplies were running low, and the constant pressure was wearing them down. Cale knew of a place, a small, isolated trading post run by a man named Mateo, someone Cale had ridden with years ago. It was a risk, but their need for food and ammunition was becoming desperate. They arrived at the post, a squat adobe building shimmering in the midday heat, with a sense of profound relief. Mateo greeted them at the door, his face breaking into a wide, welcoming smile when he saw Cale. But behind the smile, Eliza saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a deep, hunted fear. Inside. They met Mateo's wife, a quiet, weary woman, and their young son, who hid behind his mother's skirts, his large, dark eyes fixed on Cale's weapons, as the two men spoke of old times, their voices low. Eliza felt the tension in the small room grow thick enough to taste. Mateo's wife would not meet her gaze, her hands constantly twisting in her apron. That evening, as they shared a meal of beans and cornbread, the reason for the fear became clear. Mateo spoke of Blackwood's reach, how he had squeezed the few independent homesteads in the area, how a single word of defiance could lead to ruin. "He owns the water now." "Cale," Mateo said, his voice barely a whisper. "He owns the land. A man has to protect his family." The betrayal, when it came, was not violent. It was a quiet, heartbreaking act of desperation. After the meal, Mateo offered them a drink from a jug of mezcal, insisting it was a celebration of their reunion. Cale, his instincts dulled by exhaustion and the false sense of security, accepted. A short while later, a heavy, unnatural drowsiness began to settle over them. Eliza fought it, her mind screaming a warning, but her limbs felt like lead. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Mateo's face, a mask of profound anguish and shame. As he looked out the window toward the approaching dust cloud of riders, she awoke to Cale shaking her, his face a grim mask. "They're coming. Now." The drug had not fully taken hold of him, his hardened constitution fighting off the worst of its effects. But he was unsteady on his feet. They scrambled out the back of the trading post just as the first of Blackwood's men rode into the yard. They were not led by the ghost, but by a brutish foreman, a sign that this was merely the closing of a trap, not the final kill. A shot rang out, kicking up dust near Eliza's feet. They ran, stumbling through the sagebrush, their only goal to reach the labyrinth of rocks and canyons that lay a half-mile away. Another shot whizzed past Cale's head, forcing him to take cover behind a low rock outcropping. He returned fire, his shots measured and precise, but they were outnumbered and exposed. Eliza huddled behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs, the rifle he had thrust into her hands feeling impossibly heavy and alien. She watched as one of the riders dismounted, taking careful aim at Cale's position. There was no time to think, no time for the lessons or the fear. There was only the image of Cale, the man who had saved her, about to be killed. Acting on pure, primal instinct, she raised the rifle. The stock felt clumsy and cold against her shoulder. She remembered her father's voice, calm and distant. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull. She aimed in the general direction of the man, her vision blurred by panic, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a physical blow, a brutal slam that knocked the breath from her lungs and sent a shockwave of pain through her shoulder. The explosion was deafening, but through the ringing in her ears, she heard a man cry out in pain and saw the rider stumble back, his shot going wild, striking the rock above Cale's head. The moment of distraction was all Cale needed. He fired twice in quick succession, and two of the riders fell from their saddles. The others, seeing their advantage lost, hesitated and then retreated, carrying their wounded man with them. The sudden silence that followed was more profound than the noise had been. Cale pulled her to her feet, his grip on her arm tight. We have to go, before the real tracker gets here. They did not stop until nightfall, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the trading post. They made a cold camp, without a fire, in a deep, narrow wash. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving Eliza shivering in its wake. Though the night was not cold, the events of the day replayed in her mind in a sickening loop Mateo's haunted eyes. The taste of the drug, and most of all, the violent, visceral kick of the rifle against her body. She had pulled the trigger. She had shot a man. The knowledge was a nauseating weight in her gut. She was a woman of letters, of reason. Violence was an abstraction she had only read about in books. Now, it's acrid. Gunpowder smell was on her hands, its brutal reality seared into her soul. She sat apart from Cale, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the darkness. She could feel his eyes on her, but he said nothing. After a long time, he came and sat near her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him in the dark. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and rough. "I shot someone," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You survived," he corrected her, his tone devoid of judgment. "Out here. It's the same thing." He let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again. "The first man I killed, I was a boy. I did it to protect my mother. It did not make it easier. It never gets easier. You just learn to carry it." His words were not a comfort, but they were an anchor. They were an admission of a shared, terrible burden, a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. She did not feel better, but she felt a little less alone in her new, terrifying reality. They were no longer just running from Blackwood. They were running from the ghosts of who they used to be and wrestling with the people this brutal land was forcing them to become. The ghost let them know he was back on their trail the next day. He left his sign at the mouth of a box canyon, a coiled rattlesnake, pinned to the ground with a knife through its head, its tail still rattling a faint, dry warning. Cale stood looking at it for a long time, his face grim. "He's not just following," Cale said, his voice tight with a new, dawning understanding. "He's hurting us. He's pushing us east." Cale knew where they were being driven. The Serpent Spine Canyons, a treacherous, winding maze of red rock and sheer cliffs. A place where a man could get lost for weeks. A place where there were 100 spots for an ambush and only one way out. The ghost was taking away the open land, forcing them onto a battlefield of his own choosing. Eliza looked at Cale, saw the grim certainty in his eyes, and knew that the time for running was over. They had been the hunted for too long. Now, they had to turn and face the shadow that had been stalking them, and fight for their lives in the heart of his trap. The entrance to the Serpent Spine Canyons was a jagged wound in the earth, a narrow slit between towering walls of red rock that seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to swallow the sky. To enter it was to surrender the open world, to trade the vast, indifferent horizon for a place of shadows, echoes, and claustrophobic dread. This was the ghost's chosen ground, and as they rode into its maw, Eliza could feel the air grow still and heavy, the silence pressing in on them, every sound the clink of a horseshoe on stone. The creak of saddle leather ricocheted off the walls, amplified and distorted, making it impossible to tell friend from foe. Near from far, but Cale rode with a new, grim purpose. His eyes were not on the canyon walls, but on the sky above, where the clouds were gathering, their bellies a bruised, sullen purple. He had felt the change that morning, a subtle shift in the wind's direction, a dampness in the air that did not belong. He had seen the way the insects sought shelter and the birds flew low and fast toward some unseen sanctuary. A storm was coming, not a simple prairie squall, but a great, violent deluge, the kind that could turn a dry arroyo into a raging river in the span of a single heartbeat. In the face of the ghost's relentless pursuit, Cale saw not a threat, but a weapon, a wild, untamable force of nature that could be turned against their pursuer. It was a desperate, terrible gamble, a plan that relied on timing, instinct, and a faith in the heavens' fury. He had explained it to Eliza in clipped, terse sentences, his voice low and intense. She had listened, her face pale, but her eyes steady. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, resolute trust in the man beside her. They pushed deeper into the winding maze, the walls closing in, the strip of sky above them narrowing to a mere ribbon. Cale chose their path with care, leading them into a section of the canyon known for its steep, unforgiving walls and its single, narrow floor. It was a natural trap, a place where they could be cornered and finished. It was the last place the ghost would expect them to go willingly. As they rode, the first signs of the storm began to manifest. The wind rose, moaning through the high rock formations like a lost soul. A low, distant rumble, more a vibration in the chest than a sound, rolled across the land. The light began to fail, the world taking on a strange, yellow-gray cast, as if seen through a pane of dirty glass. The attack came with a sudden, brutal violence that shattered the oppressive quiet. It was not a volley of shots, but a single, well-placed arrow that thudded into the ground just inches from their horses' hooves. It was the ghost's signature, a declaration of his presence. Cale reacted instantly, swinging down from the saddle and pulling Eliza with him, dragging them both behind a massive, time-worn boulder. "Stay down," he commanded, his rifle already at his shoulder. Eliza pressed herself against the cold stone, her own rifle in her hands, her knuckles white, her heart hammered against her ribs. But her mind was strangely clear, the panic of her first firefight replaced by a cold, focused resolve. The henchmen, 4 of them, appeared on the ridges above, their forms silhouetted against the darkening sky. They began to lay down a steady, covering fire, the shots echoing like thunder in the confined space, chipping stone from the canyon walls, sending stinging shards of rock flying through the air. But Cale ignored them. His eyes were scanning the lower levels, searching for the true threat. "He's not up there," Cale said, his voice tight. "He's down here with us. He's trying to flank us." The battle became a deadly dance of movement and suppression. Cale would fire a quick burst toward the men on the ridge, forcing them to take cover, while he and Eliza scrambled to a new position, using the canyon's natural terrain as their only shield. Eliza was no longer a liability, she was a partner. She reloaded his spare rifle with a practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos. She watched the opposite side of the canyon, her eyes peeled for any sign of movement. Her role not to kill, but to see, to warn. She had become his eyes and he, her shield. Then, she saw him. The ghost. He was not a man, but a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He moved with a fluid, silent grace, using the terrain with an intimacy that was terrifying. He was circling around them, trying to get to a position where he could end the fight with a single, clean shot. "Cale, to your left," she hissed, her voice tight with urgency. "By the twisted juniper." Cale didn't hesitate. He spun, firing a single shot toward the spot Eliza had indicated. There was no cry of pain, but the ghost was forced to melt back into the shadows, his plan thwarted for the moment. It was then that the heavens finally broke. The first drops of rain were huge and cold, splattering against the hot rock with a sizzle. Within moments, the drops became a torrent, a solid, blinding curtain of water that blurred the world into a wash of gray and red. The thunder was no longer a distant rumble, but a deafening, continuous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The canyon floor, once dry and dusty, was now covered in a thin, fast-moving sheet of water. Kale looked at Eliza, a grim understanding passing between them. The time was now. The roar of the approaching flood was a sound unlike any other, a deep, grinding, elemental fury that drowned out even the thunder. It was the sound of the earth itself being torn apart. A wall of churning, brown water, thick with mud, uprooted trees, and the debris of 100 upstream washes appeared at the bend in the canyon, racing toward them with terrifying speed. The men on the ridge, caught completely by surprise, stared in horror. Their shouts of alarm were swallowed by the roar. 2 of them were swept away instantly, their forms vanishing into the maelstrom. The other 2 scrambled for higher ground, their part in the fight finished. Now, Kale yelled, grabbing Eliza's hand and pulling her toward a narrow, steep path he had identified earlier, a game trail that led up the canyon wall. They scrambled upward, the slick rock offering little purchase, the rain and wind tearing at them. The flood hit the canyon floor beneath them with the force of a battering ram, the water level rising with shocking speed. They were only halfway up the path when a surge of water, a powerful wave, crashed against the wall, tearing Eliza's feet from under her. Her grip was ripped from Kale's hand. She cried out as the current grabbed her, pulling her down into the violent, churning chaos. The water was a brutal, physical force, cold and suffocating. She was tumbled end over end, her head striking something hard, the world dissolving into a blur of pain and roaring darkness. For a moment, she saw Kale's shape above her, his face a mask of desperation as he fought to reach her. Then he too was struck by a massive floating log, and he vanished from her sight. She fought instinctively, her limbs flailing, her lungs screaming for air. The current was a merciless beast, dragging her under, spinning her around, battering her against unseen obstacles. Just as she felt the last of her strength failing, her hand brushed against something solid, a branch, with a final desperate surge of will. She hooked her arm over it, clinging to it as the floodwaters carried her on their destructive journey. The canyon walls blurred past in a terrifying rush. She saw the shape of a man, caught in the same current, struggling against a large piece of debris. It was the ghost. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the churning water. A moment of shared, primal terror. Then, a dark shape loomed in the water beside her. It was Kale. He was alive, but she could see a dark stain spreading across his side, and his movements were sluggish. He was fighting not only the current, but a grievous wound. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, his face set in a grim mask of pain and determination. Their fingers were inches apart, so close she could almost feel his touch. And then a massive surge of water, a wave born from some new collapse upstream, slammed into them, driving them apart. She saw his face one last time, an image of anguish seared into her memory, before the current pulled her under completely, and the world became nothing but a cold, violent, roaring darkness. The wrath of the heavens had saved them from their pursuers, but in its place, it had delivered a new, more terrible kind of despair, tearing them apart and casting them into the heart of its own unforgiving fury. The world returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal, gasping shock. Eliza was thrown from the water's violent embrace onto a shore of mud and broken branches, her body a single, throbbing symphony of pain. For a long time. She lay there half-drowned and shivering, the roar of the flood still echoing in her ears even as the waters receded, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly silent. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, innocent of the fury it had just unleashed. When she finally pushed herself to her knees, every muscle screaming in protest, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The canyon walls rose on either side, indifferent stone witnesses to her desolation. There was no sign of Kale, no sign of the ghost, no sign of anything but the raw, weeping wounds the flood had carved into the land. Grief was a physical weight, a crushing force that threatened to press her back into the mud and hold her there. The image of Kale's face, his hand outstretched, his eyes filled with anguish, was burned into her mind. The despair was so vast, so absolute, that for a moment, surrender seemed the only possible response. to simply lie down and let the sun and the silence claim her. But then, another voice, another memory, surfaced through the fog of her pain. It was Kale's voice, low and certain, from a dozen different lessons. Silence is life. Where that fern grows. Water weeps from the rock. You survived. The words were a lifeline, a thin thread of purpose in the overwhelming emptiness. He had not taught her these things for her to die here, a nameless victim of the wilderness. He had taught her to live. The first day was a blur of instinct and remembered lessons. Her body was a map of bruises, her dress was in tatters, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones. But her mind, sharpened by weeks of Kale's relentless tutelage, began to work. First, water. She ignored the muddy, churning river and, remembering his instruction, followed a line of newly lush vegetation up a small side wash until she found a trickle of clear water seeping from a rock face. The taste was clean, cold, and it was the first victory in a war she had not known she was prepared to fight. Next, shelter. She found a shallow overhang of rock, not quite a cave, but enough to offer protection from the wind and the night. She gathered dry leaves and grass that had been caught in high branches, away from the flood's reach, and made a crude, insulating bed. The skills that had been so foreign and difficult just weeks ago now came to her as if she had known them her entire life. The nights were the hardest. The profound silence of the wilderness was filled with the whispers of her fear. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a nightbird, sent a jolt of terror through her. She thought of predators, of the ghost, who might also have survived. And most of all, she thought of Kale, lost to the churning water. She would huddle in her small shelter, the rifle clutched to her chest, and force herself to breathe, to listen, to be the still, watchful creature he had taught her to be. She was no longer Eliza Vance, the woman of letters from Boston. That woman had died in the flood. The person who remained was someone new, someone harder, someone who knew that survival was not a matter of thought, but of will. Instead of succumbing to despair, a new, fierce resolve began to take root in her heart. She refused to believe Kale was gone. He was too strong, too skilled, too much a part of this land to be extinguished by it. Her survival was no longer just for her own sake. It became an act of faith. She would live, and she would find him. Her focus shifted from mere existence to a mission. She began to follow the river downstream, the only logical path, every morning. She would scan the banks, the debris fields, the high water marks, searching for any sign, any clue that he had passed this way. A piece of torn leather from his saddle, a boot print in a patch of drying mud. Anything. The days blurred into a grueling test of endurance. She learned to set simple snares, catching a rabbit on the third day, the small success feeling like a monumental triumph. She recognized the edible roots Kale had pointed out. Digging them from the earth with her bare, scraped hands, she was always hungry, always tired. But she was alive, and she was moving with purpose. The land that had once been her enemy was now her reluctant provider, and the skills that had been his gift were now her armor. She was leaving her own footprints in the wilderness, no longer following in his shadow, but forging her own path toward him. It was on the 9th day that she found it. Caught on the thorns of a mesquite bush, high on the riverbank, was a single, dark eagle feather, identical to the ones Kale used to fletch his arrows. It was not a thing that would have been left by the flood. It had been placed there. Deliberately. It was a sign. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through her, giving new strength to her weary limbs. The trail led her away from the river, up into the rocky, broken country. It was not a clear path. She found the next sign 2 miles on, a small stack of 3 stones, a marker so subtle that her old self would have walked past it without a glance. He was alive, and he was leaving a trail for her. She followed the signs for another day, her pace quickening, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The trail led her to a sheer rock face, a place that seemed impassable. Despair threatened to reclaim her, but she fought it back, her eyes scanning every inch of the stone. And then she saw a narrow, almost invisible opening, concealed behind a curtain of ancient, hanging vines. A cave. She entered cautiously, the rifle held ready, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air inside was cool and still. And then she saw him. He was lying on a bed of dry leaves in the far corner of the cave. So still she thought for a heart-stopping moment that she was too late. But then his chest moved. A shallow, ragged breath. He was alive, but just barely. A crude, blood-soaked bandage was wrapped around his side, and his skin was slick with the sheen of a raging fever. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was slack with unconsciousness, his brow furrowed in pain. The roles were now utterly and completely reversed. She was no longer the student, the survivor. She was the protector, the caregiver. A fierce maternal wave of determination washed over her, banishing the last of her fear. She set down her rifle and went to work. With shaking hands, she unwrapped the bandage. The wound beneath was deep and angry, the edges inflamed and infected, working by the dim light filtering into the cave. She used the last of the clean water from her skin and a piece of her own tattered dress to gently clean the wound. She remembered Cale pointing out a pale green, fuzzy-leafed plant, telling her the Pawnee called it wound binder, for its ability to draw out fever and fight infection. She spent the next hour searching the area outside the cave until she found it, chewing the leaves into a poultice, just as she had seen him do for a cut on the horse, and applied it to the wound before binding it with fresh cloth. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not leave his side. She hunted, bringing back small birds and squirrels, which she cooked over a tiny, smokeless fire at the mouth of the cave, making a thin, nourishing broth that she spooned between his cracked lips. She stood guard through the long, dark nights, listening to the sounds of the wilderness, her body a shield between him and the dangers of the world. He was lost in the grip of the fever, tossing and turning, his mind adrift in a sea of delirium, in his fever dreams. He spoke, the words tumbling out in a broken mix of English and the soft, guttural sounds of the Pawnee tongue. She sat in the darkness, listening, and the fractured story of his life pieced itself together in her heart. He spoke of a Pawnee mother with gentle hands and a white trader father who had vanished like the morning mist. He spoke of being a boy caught between 2 worlds, never fully belonging to either, mocked by the tribe for his pale eyes, distrusted by the whites for the darkness of his skin. He cried out a name, Little Star, and spoke of a promise broken, of a betrayal by the very soldiers he had guided, a massacre that had left him with the long, puckered scar on his arm and a deeper, invisible wound on his soul. She listened to his pain, to the lifetime of loneliness and loss that he had always kept hidden behind a wall of silence. And as she wiped the sweat from his brow, as she forced the life-saving broth past his lips, she felt a connection to him that went far beyond gratitude or survival. It was a profound, aching tenderness, a deep, quiet understanding of the broken pieces that made up this strong, silent man. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. She awoke from a light doze to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. The delirium was gone, replaced by a weak but lucid gaze. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. She held a water skin to his lips, and he drank, his eyes never leaving hers. There were no words of thanks, none were needed. Everything was there, in that long, silent look, gratitude, wonder, and the dawning of something new and fragile. He had saved her life with his strength and his skill. She had saved his with her will and her heart. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a woman who needed a protector. She was a woman who had become one. And in the quiet stillness of that hidden cave, 2 solitary souls, both scarred and broken by the world, began to heal, not alone, but together. Eliza Vance watched as strength slowly returned to Cale's body, a quiet, gradual tide flowing back into a man who had been nearly lost to the sea of fever and pain. The days in the cave took on a gentle, rhythmic quality, a stark contrast to the violence and terror that had preceded them. The world outside, with its sharp edges and constant threats, seemed to fade, leaving only the cool, still air of their sanctuary. A new language formed between them, one spoken not with words but with shared glances, small gestures, and a profound, comfortable silence. She would bring him water, and he would watch her with an intensity that held all the gratitude he could not yet speak. He would show her. with a slight movement of his hand, how to better smoke the meat she caught, and she would understand his meaning completely. The lines of student and teacher, protector and protected, had blurred and dissolved, leaving only two people, bound by the shared crucible of survival. As his wound began to heal, closing into a clean, pink scar, Kale started to move again. He would sit at the mouth of the cave for hours, his gaze fixed on the horizon, rebuilding his connection to the land that was his birthright. He taught her the Pawnee names for the stars that wheeled overhead in the cold. Clear nights, and she, in turn, read to him from a small, worn book of poetry she had managed to keep. Her voice a soft murmur in the vast silence, in this quiet interlude. They were not fugitives, not warriors, but simply a man and a woman, finding a fragile peace in a world that had offered them none. The ghosts of their past were still there, but in the shared space of the cave. They seemed to lose their power, their sharp edges softened by the growing light of a shared present. When Kale was finally strong enough to travel, the unspoken question of their future hung in the air. To go back was unthinkable. Redemption's End was a place of ghosts and judgment, a chapter they both knew was closed forever. They needed supplies, information, and a direction. Kale spoke of a small, neutral settlement called Three Creeks, nestled deep in the northern hills, far from Blackwood's influence. It was a place where trappers, prospectors, and those wishing to be forgotten could trade their goods and their stories without fear. It was a long, arduous journey, but it was a journey forward, away from the past, and that was all that mattered. They traveled slowly, conserving their strength, moving as one entity. The lessons Kale had taught Eliza were now second nature, and she moved through the wilderness not as a visitor, but as someone who understood its rhythms and its dangers. The journey was not a flight, but a quiet pilgrimage. They spoke more now, sharing small details of the lives they had lived before their worlds had collided. He spoke of the vast, open plains of his childhood, and she spoke of the crowded, gaslit streets of Boston. They were mapping the landscapes of their souls for each other, filling in the blank spaces, building a bridge of understanding that was stronger than any rope or stone. They arrived at Three Creeks as the sun was setting, the small collection of log cabins and canvas tents glowing warmly in the golden light. The settlement was alive with a quiet, purposeful energy. They traded the few pelts Kale had managed to gather for flour, salt, coffee, and two sturdy mules. It was in the settlement's only trading post, a long, low building that smelled of pine smoke and oiled leather, that they found the news they had not been looking for. A federal marshal, his face weary and trail-dusted, was speaking in low tones to the post's proprietor. His words, carrying across the quiet room, found Eliza and Kale where they stood by the counter. He spoke of an investigation down south, near a town called Redemption's End. A notorious tracker known as the Ghost, along with a handful of hired guns, had vanished without a trace in the Serpent Spine Canyons after a freak flash flood. Their disappearance, coupled with rumors of widespread land fraud, had brought the law down from the territorial capital. The marshal spoke of ledgers filled with false debts, of deeds signed under duress, of a silent, paper-based tyranny, with his enforcers gone and his crimes laid bare. Silas Blackwood's empire had not been brought down in a blaze of glory, but had simply collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The system had devoured itself. Eliza and Kale listened, their faces impassive. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying taste of vengeance. There was only a profound, quiet sense of release. The monster that had haunted their steps was gone, not slain by their hands, but consumed by its own darkness. The past was no longer a hunter at their heels. It was a distant echo, a story that belonged to someone else now. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance, they both understood. They were free, not just free from Blackwood, but free from the ghosts of the past. Free to choose a future that was not defined by what they had run from, but by what they were walking toward. That night, they made their camp on a low hill overlooking the settlement. They did not speak of Redemption's End. They did not speak of justice or revenge. They spoke of the North, of the vast, unsettled territories where the mountains were still unnamed and the valleys were green and full of promise. They made their decision not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet, shared certainty. Their path did not lie behind them. The next morning, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, they turned their faces north. The final leg of their journey was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet anticipation. They were no longer running, they were seeking. After many weeks of travel, they crested a high ridge, and the world seemed to open up before them. Below lay a valley, a perfect emerald jewel nestled between the protective arms of the mountains. A river, clear and silver, snaked through its heart, and groves of aspen and pine dotted the landscape. The air was clean and cool, and the only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall grass. They stood there for a long time, side by side, looking down at the valley. It was a place of peace, a place of new beginnings. It was a place where a man and a woman, both scarred and broken by the world, could build something new, something that would last. They had found their sanctuary, not in a town or a fortress, but in the vast, open heart of the land, and in the quiet, unshakable strength they had found in each other. Cale reached out and took Eliza's hand, his touch no longer that of a rescuer, but of a partner, a companion. Her fingers laced with his, a silent, perfect fit. They had not found a place to hide from the world, but a place to finally begin living in it. This was not an ending, it was where the sun rises,